Happy Easter, everybody. As I'm recording this, it's the morning of Easter Sunday. I hope the spring weather finds everyone all right. In my case, I have tendonitis in my left wrist and right leg as a consequence of some old injury, and spring weather is kind of torture. In fact, I've had to walk on a cane on this leg all week, but I guess it's finally starting to feel better. So, editing my introduction video taught me something important, which is that without a script and rehearsal, I make Joe Biden look coherent. I know that's going to date this, but I don't care. So I have a script just over here to my left, and I did rehearse. So let's see if I can make this a bit more coherent. Okay, so the point of today's video, given the date and the topic, I used to be a hardcore atheist and philosophical materialist. And I'm not talking about, an edgy teen atheist. I mean, I was an activist. I had dinner with Dave Silverman twice. And of course, I'm not an atheist anymore. If you've seen the channel intro video I shot last week, I said that I'm a theist and a spiritualist. And so the point of this video is how I got into atheism, how I left and found theism, and how I can justify that with being both a philosopher and a scientist. So I was raised Catholic, and I think one of the earliest things, like most science nerds, is just the Christian opposition to science is, I think, where a lot of us start off in rejecting religion as being, almost a personal attack on our interests. Now, the Catholic Church is cool with evolution, at least officially. In my experience, rank and file, not so much. But, opposition to stem cell research, opposition to cloning, for no seemingly rational reason, did rub me the wrong way. And I know this is extremely personal and weird, but at the time when I was younger, I was very interested in herpetology, and I found, I can't really explain it rationally, but the vilification of snakes in Christianity just really rubbed me the wrong way. But I was still interested in religion on some level, I think, just because I think I had a sense of what Rudolf Otto called a sense of the sacred. I remember one time praying for something to happen, and it was very unlikely that it would happen, but I prayed, and I prayed hard, and I don't remember what it was now, but the next day it did come true. And I suppose it could be confirmation bias, but it just felt so unusual that I think that's what sort of kept me there for a while. But what really caused my antipathy for religion occurred in my early teen years. There was two important things that happened in my early teen years. One is I got very interested in my Celtic heritage, and so I started reading literature from Celtic neo-paganism and Wicca, and these things I started to learn about the history of Celtic culture. And then it's not even the Catholics, it's the fundamentalist Protestants, and they would rant about the occult, and particularly Halloween. They love to rant about Halloween, and as a Celt for whom that was one of our most important holidays, it just came off as deeply racist. And that, even to this day, I think a lot of the anti-Catholic, anti-Halloween stuff is rooted in anti-Irish racism. But the other thing that happened was that my teen years really corresponded to the second Bush administration. And as that went on, science was so politicized. I was about 14 when Kitzmiller v. Dover happened in this state. Like, you couldn't just have a passing interest in science. You had to be willing, the sense in that day was you had to be willing to fight to defend evolution from the fundies. And that's what I think is so weird about it. It was, it's not it wasn't the Catholic Church I was raised in that pushed me against religion. It was the fundamentalist Protestants that, run our society. So I was about 15 when Richard Dawkins published The God Delusion, and I read it, and it helped me sort out some thoughts in my head, and I realized that I had probably been an atheist for a lot longer than I realized. Or maybe at the very least some kind of mesotheist, that if a God existed, he was probably evil, but God probably didn't exist. And so I started to get into that. The new atheist movement was fresh at the time, and I got into reading all that sort of philosophy. I do want to say that and this will be important for later, I did keep my interest in the occult. And through the occult, I came across Jung's theory of... Sorry about that. I had a phone call and I was shooting this on my iPhone, so without my airplane mode engaged, so we know for next time. Okay, where was I? Jungian theory of the archetypes. So for about a century now, many occultists have justified their position by saying that they're just engaging with archetypes as a kind of psychotherapy. If you're familiar with Jordan Peterson, he never comes out and expressly says it because he can't seem to say anything concisely, but this seems to be his position about Christianity. That Christianity to him is archetypal. It's a kind of therapy. Anyway, through this study of Jung, I started reading Anton LaVey. And yes, reading the Satanic Bible for the first time is transgressive. I know this is the Satanic Rituals, but same author. But it was an ethic and an aesthetic that was consistent with an atheistic worldview, but it also maintained a religious praxis. And I was able to sort of stay in touch with religious praxis through this idea, and that, I think, played a big role later on in the story. Anyway, I was about 16 when that happened. So I go to college, and I'm very, very active in the atheist community. The Secular Humanist Association at Rutgers University, which is where I met David Silverman, and I had some email exchanges with Matt Dillahunty, who I deeply respect. If he's watching this, I have a tremendous amount of respect for Matt Dillahunty, even if he's someone I profoundly disagree with now. But I started to seriously study philosophy. And through my study of philosophy, I came to realize it started with the deconstruction of positivism. We took a philosophy of science class, we set up the positivist position, and I'm like, yeah, okay, that's what I seem to believe in. And the professor goes, basically, we're going to explain everything that's wrong with that. And it was lecture after lecture after lecture of, here's all the problems with the positivist worldview. And I just got to the point where I realized that if I was going to be a consistent skeptic, I had to challenge my fundamental assumptions about science And I got to the point where I realized I couldn't defend the existence of the material world. Any argument for the existence of the material world, I could shred just as easily as I could shred creationism. Well, it's hard to be a materialistic atheist if you have so many fundamental doubts about materialism. It was at this time that I was taking courses in Eastern philosophy that I came across for the class the Upanishads, the Hindu sacred texts. And the Upanishads take the position that matter doesn't actually exist. It's a 100% idealist cosmology, and because of that, they don't have to deal with these problems. So, the sacred texts of 1 billion people had been able to develop a coherent position that solved the doubts that I had, right? You can live a completely coherent existence with anti-materialism, with actively disbelieving that matter exists, which was quite empowering. And while that didn't do it on its own, it was enough to send me down my trajectory. So I owe a debt to the Hindus for my religious reconversion. So the continuation of those thoughts, Platonic philosophy, Hindu philosophy, Buddhist philosophy, and idealism just kind of strengthened. In my last year of college, I ended up suffering from depression, and it continued throughout that. If you watched my lecture at LIPS, you know that I left law school after only a semester. It was largely because I couldn't deal with the depression and get good grades and at the same time. So I had some bad experiences with mental health professionals when I was younger. The TLDR, ABA therapy should be illegal. So I didn't get proper medical help until I was almost 2 years into my depression. In the meantime, I went back to my Jungian psychiatry, and I tried to do a ritual to try to treat some of my depression symptoms. And I decided to, I've got my candles, I've got my ritual circle set up, and I decided to open my ritual with the Bornless invocation. The Bornless invocation is a ritual performed in the Hermetic tradition. It's a prayer to God in the Hermetic tradition. So this is the first time I'm saying this prayer after I became a theist. I'd said it as an atheist, but this is the first time I engaged in it as a theist, and I couldn't even finish it. Felt like getting hit by something out of the blue, and I'm on the knees in the ritual circle just crying. Being honest, this was a genuine invocation of the power of God, and the power came through. I can't really tell the story linearly from there because it's kind of fuzzy, but I eventually got interested in Christian existentialism and esoteric Christian thought. Guys like Swedenborg and the Rosicrucians. So I was involved with that for a while. I had some friends who were Quakers, and I kind of got involved with that. Quakers are about the experience. They don't really care about theological distinction, so people of any theology are welcome in most Society of Friends meetings. But I came to realize that there were just far too many theological problems with Christianity. Like even from the perspective of a believer, I don't see how you could read the Old Testament and still be a Christian after reading the Old Testament. I also think there's something genuinely spiritually malevolent in a lot of these churches. especially a lot of the Protestant ones. That's a story for another time. So through my esotericism, I started to develop contacting spirits, the ability to, well, not contact them, but perceive the ones that were there. And I discovered that I had quite a prodigious talent for channeling, and so I developed mediumship skills, which I never expected to develop as, you know, a science nerd. Then I've gone around to some Buddhist temples. It's a lot of Buddhist meditation techniques that finally helped me sort of get out of my depression. And I've encountered the Bodhisattvas. I've encountered the Amida Buddha through my channeling. But I don't really see myself as a Buddhist because as someone who's experienced this stuff as spiritual reality, it just doesn't make sense. I don't need a religion of gravity. So, I also have retained some of my esoteric Christian beliefs as well. Like, I think that Jesus was, in fact, the Messiah. So there's all this sort of complexity that I really lack a coherent identity at this point. I say spiritualist because that's probably the most important factor about my spiritual life, is the contact with the spirits directly. And I may do some channelings later on this channel. I may, I don't know, form a circle of some kind, and people who are interested in it. And I do believe that while Catholic theology is silly, Catholic rituals are spiritually valid. And I've long had an interest in independent sacramental esotericism. I suppose the main takeaway, though, is how can I, as someone with philosophical training and a scientist, believe in this stuff? Well, my argument for God is simple, not philosophically rigorous right now, but, you know, just broad strokes is: 1, materialism is silly. 2, the best alternative to materialism is idealism. Idealism implies minds, definitionally, causal priority of minds. Causally prior minds are a good definition for God. Therefore, the most reasonable explanation for the universe is one that contains gods. The argument for spirits has to do with a complex discussion of epistemology and veridical perception and privileged perceptions. Again, to do this really quickly, evolutionary theory predicts that the majority of people would not perceive the world as accurately as it should, because there's not a lot of survival value there. And if you had imagined a situation where 99% of the people are blind, their lack of experience just shouldn't count as evidence. It's the 1% of seeing people who get to tell you about what things look like. So if, let's say, 1% of the world's population has mediumistic abilities, if I say, well, the spirit world shows this to me, you can say, I don't have evidence for that. No, sorry. My position, my telling you is evidence, and you have to shut up about it. And if the majority of those who have mediumship abilities show the same thing, then that's clearly a body of empirically testable evidence. I intend to get into these arguments deeper and fuller in the course of time. But happy Easter. Take care. May the spirit of Raphael, the celestial physician, keep you healthy in this dire time. Thank you.